We're here to talk about utility beyond claims and accelerating corporate climate action, because even though there is research showing that the more companies invest in high quality carbon credits, the faster they do decarbonize. However, the market, especially in the last couple of years, has been slow to pick up, and prices have been low, and this is largely because of concerns about being caught up in bad headlines and scandals and projects that come with problems. However, there's a lot of work being done to build integrity and sort of provide assurances of the quality of carbon credits. So I would like to kick off by just having my speakers introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their views on the issue at hand. And we'll start with Andrea.
Thank you. Hello, good morning, still morning, everybody. Nice to be here. So I'm Andrea Abrahams. I work at IETA, not to be confused with IATA. IETA is the International Emission Trading Association. We're a membership association of some 350 companies around the world, with a full-time secretariat of about 50 policy staff. And what we do is track carbon markets and try and advance what good looks like in carbon markets. It's a very useful group to be part of because it gives you a very insightful understanding of how the market is being perceived, what's been accepted, what's not been accepted, beyond what perhaps is being launched in the media. And that's because across the membership base, we have buyers, we have project developers, we have crediting programs, we have service providers, lawyers, consultancies. So you get all views on the table. And this is very helpful for this conversation because one of the views that comes through quite strongly from buyers, and I'm sure you'll talk more about this as well, is that it's very, very hard for companies to decarbonize. And especially for high emitting companies, the task of delivering net zero is extremely difficult. And we have not made it easy in the world of guidance setters and guidance providers because we don't have alignment on what that looks like. And in particular, one of the most important mechanisms that you can use to assist you, which is carbon markets, we don't have alignment on how you can use carbon markets. So we can talk a lot more about that. I'm not sure how long you want me to carry on with my introduction, but I've got lots on that.
Great.
Okay.
Tim from Salesforce, which is one of the companies that is investing quite heavily in carbon credits. Tell us a bit about what is Salesforce doing and what has attracted Salesforce to the market.
Yeah, thank you. The voluntary carbon market is not for the faint-hearted. So first of all, I would like to applaud every one of you who works in the voluntary carbon market because it is not easy, but it is necessary. As Andrea said, compensating for residual emissions is a part of our overall climate transition plan and our strategy. I'll go later a little bit into how we buy credits and why, and how we also want to set market signals, but want to start with our new science-based target, which we published today, actually. So 67% Scope 1 and 2 market-based emission reductions by 2030, 68% Scope 3 market-based emission intensity reduction by 2030, 90% Scope 1 and 2 emission reductions by 2040, and 97 Scope 3 market-based intensity emission reductions by 2040. Those are our targets, and they're hard because we travel, for example, and even though we want to buy sustainable aviation fuel, it does not exist. So we've made investments with our carbon credits, but also with other funding into creating the markets that can supply us not only with carbon credits, but also with the technology and the means to decarbonize. Because for us, it is essential that companies do both, to reduce and invest. Reduce your emissions as fast and far as you can, and invest in the voluntary carbon market, because that in turn will also supply many of the solutions that we need to decarbonize further. So I'll go later a little bit into which types of credits we buy, what market signals we set, but I just wanted to make sure it's clear that any company that invests has to do this as part of a broader climate transition plan.
And Mark, what is the VCMI doing to this end to build integrity, including, you've already talked about this morning, but your announcement today on Scope 3?
Thanks, Sarah. But before I say anything, just I hope everyone heard that. Congratulations, Tim, on that. I mean, that's a big deal. So impressive. Not the ideal global context for be making ambitious announcements like that, so good for you. So VCMI, Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, we are part of that sort of evolving ecosystem trying to build integrity and trust across carbon markets with the idea that that will be the basis for scale. And we fundamentally believe that unless someone in this room has got a better idea about how to channel private sector finance into mitigation projects in developing countries that are not the least cost options and may be difficult to finance, if anyone's got a better way of doing it than carbon markets, I'm all ears. I've been doing it for 30 years now, and I've been seeking all those 30 years some other way of doing it. But we have carbon markets. They're not perfect, but they can work. And when they work well, they can transfer not only large sums of carbon finance, but climate financing more generally to places where they're needed most and where the opportunities to reduce and remove emissions will not hang around because people will choose the higher cost opportunity unless carbon finance is in place. So VCMI does two things. We provide guidance and certifiable standards for the demand side of the market. That's helping companies make use of carbon credits as part of an integrated approach to their corporate climate transitions. You heard Tim talk about what Salesforce will be doing internally, but we think as a complement to that, and particularly those of you who heard me this morning will have heard that 47% of companies with science-aligned targets are way off track for their Scope 3 emissions. And so the excuse cannot be do nothing. So we provide guidance for how companies can use carbon credits to complement their own internal decarbonisation and take responsibility not just in 2030 or 2040 when their target years are, but this year, next year, and every single year, because as we all know, we can't just wait to reduce and remove emissions. The other thing that VCMI does to build that enabling environment is we work with countries that are hosting carbon crediting projects to help them think about how carbon finance can be used strategically. So one option would be cover your finest agricultural land in eucalyptus trees, flog some cheap carbon credits and hope for the best. Probably not great for the economy, not great for the farmers, and not going to lead to much transformation in the future. But if you think about carbon finance as a way of leveraging other sources of capital, some reports suggest you can get 7 or 8x leverage in terms of bringing in other forms of investment, but also to bring in technology and skills that you'll need to build that low carbon economy of the future. Carbon markets and carbon finance can play a very strategic catalytic role. So we help countries design their strategies so they maximize the long-term impact of carbon finance.
Thank you. Andrea, to start with, give us a bit sort of the lay of the land. I guess you talked to a lot of companies that are considering or already actively investing in the voluntary carbon market. What are their fears and what are their hopes? What's keeping companies out of the market so far?
So just to keep this in perspective, because I think sometimes the carbon market gets far too much attention and often it's negative. To keep it in perspective, from some research that we did, 80% of the world's largest companies have not even set a net zero pathway. And the CDP report that just came out, of the close to 23,000 companies that report on CDP, only a quarter of those have got a 1.5 degree plan in place. So the big problem is we need corporates to get on the program. You know, we need all corporates to agree that they are part of the problem and therefore need to be part of the solution. That's step number one. And then look at all the tools at their disposal to decarbonize. And this is where carbon markets comes in. It is one of the tools. Why is it such an incredibly valuable tool? It's valuable because it's available today. Many low-cost technologies and alternative decarbonising options are either too expensive or not available. Carbon markets are available today. Secondly, they're available everywhere. So if you haven't got a piece of low-carbon kit in the geography that you're in, carbon markets can still help you. So they're available everywhere. Thirdly, they're pretty cost-effective at the moment. Prices are going to go up, but they're pretty cost-effective, and they will remain cost-effective for some time. And the fourth thing, which I think is probably the most sort of valuable aspect of carbon markets, is that they're a flexible mechanism. So what I mean by that is when you have done everything, as you said, you'll do to decarbonise, and then you can't quite get to your target, what do you then do? You either miss your target, which is happening more and more, and you mentioned it in your piece up front this morning, Mark, or you pull this lever, this flexible lever, where you say, I've got to top up now to reach my targets. It's irresponsible to miss my target or irresponsible to move my target. I'm going to use carbon markets. And then you should use carbon markets every single year until you get back on your net zero trajectory. So I think those are all the really valuable reasons, and then we can talk more about why it's not working as well as it should.
Yeah, and then Tim, you said that you could talk a bit more about the kinds of credits that Salesforce invests in. What is Salesforce looking for? What are you very wary of staying away from? What makes you choose where to put your money?
Yeah, I think we're looking for the same as everybody else: high quality, robust carbon credits at an affordable price.
And how do you what guarantees that quality?
And navigating the voluntary carbon market has become a lot easier in the past years, thanks to VCMI and also the ICVCM and independent rating agencies that now pre-screen credits for buyers like us, like Silvera, where Salesforce is also an investor in Silvera, B0, Calyx Global. So we ask those rating agencies to pre-screen, and then we look at the best of that portfolio, and then at the moment we buy spot market credits from those suppliers, but we've also made some long-term commitments to set market signals, because this is a market that needs to still develop and grow while prices need to come down, hopefully through more demand. And one of the things we need urgently right now is more nature, because it's available at large scale: forests, agroforestry, reforestation, but also saving existing forests. Nobody can match that scale of nature right now. In the long term, because of the permanence of putting away the carbon for 1,000 years or more, or 100 years, which is the standard, we need technological solutions, CDR, carbon dioxide removal. So we've also made a $100 million commitment to buy CDR, and we're looking at new technologies there, but they're all fairly expensive. They're all small scale, so this is a market that needs to scale. And in the meantime, we've made a commitment on nature-based removals with the Symbiosis Coalition to buy 20 million tons together with Microsoft, Google, and Meta of high-quality nature-based carbon. We've made a blue carbon commitment to buy from mangroves, so other essential ecosystems that have very high co-benefits for fisheries and local livelihoods and biodiversity, for at least 1 million ton. We have been very active in the LEAF Coalition that invests in avoided deforestation at the jurisdictional level. So this is an important distinction, right, for those of us in the know, because forests you have to conserve at a large enough level so that they're stable. Forests are stable for thousands of years at a very large level, but an individual tree or an individual forest can burn or blow over in a storm or be cut. So you have to have that large perspective. That's why we invest in the LEAF Coalition at the jurisdictional level of REDD+. So that's what we're doing to also set some market signals.
And so would you like to see more companies investing? Would it be sort of beneficial to you? As Andrew said, it will push the price up.
So it sometimes feels a bit lonely sitting on these panels because, where is everybody? There's these 80% of companies that Andrea mentioned that still need to set a target, but once they have one, it's inevitable that carbon credits will have to be part of your portfolio, because I mentioned sustainable aviation fuels. We are trying to shift all our flights and all our travel to SAF, but so is UPS, so are all the large logistics providers. there's not enough sustainable aviation fuel right now. So it's not an option. Either you don't travel, which we have a 2% per year travel flight reduction target, which we've overachieved last year. So we're reducing our flights, but we still travel, and so do all of us. Mm-hmm. And what do we do with those emissions? For me, it's more a pragmatic discussion than an ideological one, which it sometimes can be. And I think all the companies, first of all, have to have a science-based target, and then they have to engage, and VCM has to be part of the options. In the future, of course, these markets will move more to regulated markets and compliance markets.
And Mark, as Tim just said, the VCM has changed a lot. You've got new standard setters and rating agencies. There are still critics who say that including Andrew Forrester of Fortescue yesterday, he was very outspoken in saying carbon credits sort of make money for bankers and others, but it's kind of taking attention away from actually reducing emissions. What's your response to that? And what is the business case for investing in?
So I don't know, Andrew, but it seems a bit rich that a CEO of a company that's designed to make profits should be worried about people making money. But that, being serious about it, there have been accusations and concerns that a lot of money disappears in the bit between the project and the buyer of the credit, and so that the project owners or the community may get 50 cents and the credit sold for $10, $15. Where's all that money going in the middle? I think in some cases that's certainly true. In some cases it's overblown because the rigor and levels of scrutiny that the market demands of credits means that you have to have independent validation, you have to have independent verification. You may be using all sorts of digital tools which cost money. You need to develop the project properly, you need to make sure you share not only the benefits, but the project is co-designed with the community, so the community benefits. And all of those things cost money. And that's why coming at the current price, while it may be attractive for some buyers, it's just too low to guarantee that sort of quality and integrity that we need. So look, the other kind of comment I would make is that if we are expecting perfection, then we should go home. I mean, I'm sure Tim will tell you that they have to continually look at their carbon footprint and their inventory. Their suppliers change, the intensity of their electricity they get from the grid changes. A whole bunch of things change the whole time. That's not to say that their inventory is wrong. It just means that things change. Technologies change, ability to measure change. And that's going to be the same for companies, it's the same for countries. I remember in 1997 when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, the headline was, industrialized countries will reduce their emissions by 5.2%, at which point the chief scientist said plus or minus 25. That's not the point. I mean, yes, we need to measure these things, but it's getting the direction of travel right. And so if we say we find one carbon credit that is not perfect, therefore we throw the whole market away, then we are failing to find a way to drive finance to emissions reductions that are lower cost and available now. So that's not an excuse to say anything goes. That's why we have the ICVCM, and you're going to hear from Doris later, why you have VCMI, why you have the ratings agencies that Tim's mentioned, why you have a whole bunch of companies that are developing new technologies for quantifying, for monitoring, for new techniques for permanence, insurance companies coming to underwrite some of the risk. So the market has significantly matured. I've been doing this for 25 years, and what we did 25 years ago we thought was good enough. It's got considerably better. I wouldn't expect to have the same treatment for a medical problem that I would have had 50 years ago than I have now. Things change. The world would still be flat if we didn't allow science to move on. So we've got tools for managing the risk. We can use those tools to discount some credits when we know if they have a medium or medium-high rating, then there are things we can do. You could use 1.5 credit for every ton you're compensating. There are different ways we can do this. I think transparency is absolutely the key. So understanding this. As long as one side pretends that every carbon credit is a perfect ton and the other side assumes that they're worth nothing, then we don't drive this forward and we miss opportunity after opportunity to reduce emissions. And as others have said, there are points where companies cannot go further. They may be trying their best. The Scope 3 code of practice that we announced this morning is premised on the fact, as I've said already, 47% of companies are way off on their Scope 3, and by 23, their Scope 3 emissions gap will be the size of the whole of the US's emissions. So we can either go, it's a shame, or we find tools which enable and require companies to take action. And carbon credit markets done well are one good way of doing that.
And so, Andrea, you said we can also talk about what are the problems in the market, and kind of to move forward also what policies are coming in, especially in Europe and the UK, but in general, what policies are starting to help address those issues?
Yeah, so there are a lot of really positive things coming on, to pick up on what you were saying. Before I go there, I just want to pick up on one point on this investment case. I think the one thing that hopefully we are starting now to get right is a more realistic narrative about that decarbonising has to have a good business case. You have to have a business case to decarbonise, and you have to have a business case to use carbon markets. Carbon markets will not happen for philanthropic reasons. They will happen because investors generate a return from carbon markets. So we need to change our mindset that carbon markets are something that people do for the goodness of their heart. That's not to say that where there's disproportionate rent taking across the value chain that shouldn't be addressed, and where there's an imbalance of power, perhaps with Indigenous communities and investors, that we can't look for safeguards to address that. But it's really important that we think about this as a business, and people will want to return from that business. I think from another really sort of positive signal, before I get to the regulation, is the buyer coalitions. I'm so glad you mentioned them, Tim, because I don't think they're necessarily a long-term solution, but they're really good interim solution, because they do cluster finance and therefore de-risk a bit for the corporates who are putting money in and making very large-scale investments, often in quite expensive technologies like removal. So I think they're a really positive thing. The third thing that's really positive is governments who are starting to signal that actually private sector finance is very, very necessary to deliver Paris. The most recent was last week. The Paris government released a charter. They called it in the end, it started as a pledge, but as a charter, showing the commitment to the importance of carbon markets, supporting Article 6, but carbon markets more broadly. The week before that, the UK government released a consultation seeking support from the market for really backing what good quality, high integrity carbon markets look like, and we're certainly going to lean into that extensively. And the German government is also signalling an interest and starting to question why carbon markets should not be used within the EU ETS, and without it, it's going to be very difficult to deliver. So those are sort of just signalling the role of the private sector, but of course more broadly, the G7, the G20, and countries are increasing their action around carbon markets, carbon pricing schemes, including carbon tax schemes that use offsets within those tax schemes, and they also create demand in the market. So there's a lot of very positive things starting to happen, and I think it's all starting to move in the right direction.
And actually, Mark, also, what are your thoughts? The UK consultation included taking into account VCMI's and ICVCM's frameworks. What did you think of that announcement? What kind of boost can this type of government support bring to the market?
So I think, going back to something that Andrea said, without a business case or a value proposition, companies will not invest in anything. And carbon markets are no different from anything else. 3 to 4 years ago, companies saw value, brand value, reputational value from being carbon neutral or whatever it happened to be. And for a number of reasons that we all know, scrutiny of credits, scrutiny of the claims, that business case has more or less disappeared. So companies, we did some research, companies by and large want to be able to use carbon credits as part of a corporate decarbonisation journey in the same way that Tim has talked about. But they need air cover and they need clear rules about how and when. And I think given that the corporate standard setters as yet are not providing them with that kind of clarity, there's a process going on in ISO and SBTi is revising its corporate net zero standard, they're looking increasingly to governments. Who has the authority to tell them that they can or cannot and what they can and cannot do? So they're looking to governments. And so it's not surprising that the UK, I mean, even the US, before the new administration came in, issued some principles on what high quality voluntary carbon or carbon credit markets would look like. And as Andrea said, we've had France, the UK, Singapore's working on, several others are looking at that kind of guidance. And it responds exactly to what corporates need. This is what you must do, this is what you can do, and then we will support you if you do it. But if you don't do it like this, then you're in the wrong place and you shouldn't be taking action. So we're 100% supportive of that. When we started out 3 years ago, a clear part of our vision was a pathway to regulation. I mean, my personal view, having been working on climate change for a very long time, is that we have been negotiating on climate change since 1988. That's 37 years. And if we're still relying on, the fact that we're still relying on voluntary initiatives, it's just testament to our collective failure. So the sooner we get good quality, smart, investment grade policy in place, the better.
And Tim, I mean, Salesforce has obviously ploughed ahead with this without waiting for regulation, but do you see these kinds of regulations, also the EU's Green Claims Directive, the carbon removal and carbon farming frameworks, do you see this as positive sort of support coming in?
Yeah, let's be clear that any market needs regulation, because markets are only good at one thing: match supply and demand and figure out a price. That's what markets do, nothing else, right? So everything else has to be set in another way. And I think especially the demand signal coming from regulation is very powerful and works. Like Brazil has just adopted a carbon law, and that means now there's massive amounts of influx into saving and restoring Brazil's forests. State of Querétaro in Mexico has done the same, where companies can choose to either pay a carbon tax or invest in projects that help stabilize the climate, and that's unleashed a huge amount of stable and predictable flow of funding for nature and for carbon technology. So, of course, those things are very helpful. Why it's still important to invest in the voluntary carbon market right now is because it's the R&D department of that kind of large-scale compliance regulated market, which we will need at some point, because the scale of the problem is now becoming so massive that it will have to be regulated more clearly, and governments are starting to do that. So I think we still need the VCM investments. We obviously still need companies to decarbonize, and I would be remiss not to mention that Salesforce also has a great product for helping companies do that called Net Zero Cloud. Speak to my colleagues here in the back of the room if you want to do what technology we use to decarbonize our own supply chain. But it's clear that we need the VCM for unlocking larger climate action, which at some point will have to be more regulated.
I think, sorry, so just interrupt.
Yeah,
I think Tim's touched on an important point. It's, in the past, we talked about sort of regulated markets like emissions trading schemes and the voluntary carbon market. Now it's more of a spectrum. And it's possible, you could imagine at some point in the future, some countries might mandate that companies have to buy a certain number of carbon credits. That would be sort of pure compliance. Then you've got the choice to use carbon credits to meet either some current or future obligation. Singapore's carbon tax, the examples that Tim's already given, where company can choose to use carbon credits to offset some of its liability, but it doesn't have to. And then there'll be pure voluntary and a whole bunch of stuff in between. And I think it's important to talk about that, because we've got so stuck into this voluntary versus compliance thing as if they're in a way opposed. But actually, if you look at Article 6.4 rules and what the ICVCM and others have done, there's convergence rather than divergence, and that's going to be a good thing over time as well.
And I just quickly wanted to remind people that you can ask questions through Slido, and we will be going to questions soon. But Tim, I wondered, are there certain jurisdictions or destinations that are more attractive for investment because it's a more developed regulatory system or friendlier government? Where are you looking geographically?
So we are very encouraged, for example, by Brazil. I mentioned that example, and we've actually been involved in helping them to build a strong carbon law. They are, obviously, they have huge possibilities. There's 20 million hectares of degraded lands, much of that public lands. The government has now started to give out restoration concessions. There's 6 million hectares of reforestation need in the Amazon. Of course, we need to protect what's still there, first of all, but the government has brought down the deforestation rate by half within just a year, and now is turning towards restoring that 6 million hectares in the arc of restoration of the Amazon. And I think at COP30 this year, we'll see massive, not only private sector signals, but also government signals with the Tropical Forest Forever facility, for example, that the president of Brazil is setting up to help tropical forest countries maintain their forest cover. That is all hugely positive. So I think other developing countries, but also even the EU, the US, can look at Brazil and see how that is working for their own economic development, because this is mostly a domestically focused carbon market that can channel investments into projects in Brazil, but also foreign direct investment. So it's working very well for them.
And Andrea, do you see certain areas or countries being more attractive or kind of moving ahead?
I mean, yes, the countries that are more evolved with their carbon policy are clearly, it reduces an element of uncertainty. But what's really encouraging is that there are more and more corporates, like you just explained, Tim, but also carbon funds who are getting involved in the really early stage of carbon project development. MSCI tracked this, and just in the first 3 months of this year, that was $5 billion, and last year it was $3 billion. So this is putting money into early stage carbon project development. And what's so exciting to see is that big blue chip corporates bring their own deep understanding of due diligence and risk management and risk mitigation strategies into the development of carbon projects. So, you know, you've got these opportunities where they're coming in early stage and they're saying, this is the level of assurance we want, this is the level of quality we want, and really helping build, you know, the standard of the overall market. And I think that's really exciting, because it's not necessarily what you're seeing on the surface, but it's sort of a little bit, you know, behind the scenes. And there's a lot of good money, you know, going into these initiatives. And back to sort of the points both of you made, ultimately what you're looking for is you're looking for a unit, a credit, that is completely fungible. So you can sell it into Corsair, you can sell it into Article 6.2, you can sell it into a local domestic scheme, you can sell it into corporates for net zero. That's attractive to investors. So I think the more regulators can get their heads around what's really appealing for investors, the more attractive you make it for investors to invest in those countries.
And actually, on that note, an increasing number of countries in their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement are talking about Article 6, some of them just keeping the option open, saying they're developing regulations or looking into it, some of them saying quite clearly that they want to either offer carbon credits or buy them. What effect do you think this will have on the VCM? Do you think it will kind of unleash more confidence? Tim, do you want to, whoever would like to?
Yeah, it's the billion-dollar question, but it's, I think both of you are a better place to answer how we merge Article 6 and the voluntary carbon market, or NEST, and I think that, of course, we hope that that will happen. That's our...
Yeah.
There are different ways that convergence can happen. I mean, Article 6.4, so the project-based mechanism, already allows buyers, if they're corporates, to use the units for voluntary purposes to meet their own voluntary commitments without authorization and accounting and corresponding adjustments in accounts. It allows companies in those countries where they're allowed to use those credits to meet their compliance obligations to do so. For example, I mentioned the Singapore carbon tax. They can use Article 6.4 credits with a corresponding adjustment, but they can also use credits from voluntary carbon market methodologies that have been approved by the committee that oversees that in Singapore. So firstly, you've already got different use cases for both credits from the voluntary market and credits from Article 6.4. If you look at some of the countries that have carbon taxes or have schemes that allow companies to use carbon credits, very often they've used methodologies from the voluntary market, as Corsair has. And so one would expect those to converge over time. In Article 6.2, the country-to-country transactions, I know that ICVCM, for example, has been working very hard to help countries adopt the core carbon principles as the basis for the projects that underpin Article 6.2 transactions. So you've got bits of compliance and bits of voluntary all coming together. Where some of that will converge is through the registries and through the dashboards that provide disclosure on what companies and countries use. And you'll be able to see the comparability, you'll be able to use the ratings that people have mentioned already to see what quality of credit's using. So I don't think it will be, the regulation will help that convergence, because every time a country says this company must or can use carbon credits, it will define which ones, and hopefully they will define the quality standards or the rating rather than which mechanism they come from, and that will help convergence. And then with transparency, the pressure on companies to use what are considered high quality credits regardless of where they come from will drive convergence to the higher standard, and that I think will bring the market together as well.
Thank you. We will turn to Slido questions. Andrea, did you have any thoughts on that, on Article 6, quickly? And then we'll pick up some questions here. Or if
So
you
much
don't
to
have-
say on Article
Yeah.
6, but I think it just to your question on the sort of where voluntary carbon market, Article 6 domestic schemes come together. To me, it's all about capacity building, because voluntary carbon markets, if they really exist, I mean, South Africa is a great example. I do quite a bit of work there. I mean, on the ground, you've had the voluntary carbon market operating for ages. Then they introduced a tax scheme that allowed for credits to be used as part of paying for your tax. Hey, presto, we've already got credits in the country. We've already got people who know how to do these things. Now they're looking at expanding the tax. They want, X number more million credits. Great, project developers are there. They understand the game. Now they're looking at 6.2 and 6.4. You build, it's a capacity building challenge to build as layers of understanding and knowledge about the carbon market. So I think, where the voluntary carbon market has already been playing in countries, they really have an advantage and a bit of a leapfrog.
Thank you. So I'm going to take Luke's question first, because it was something I wanted to ask as well. Everyone's waiting on SBTI as well and their corporate net zero standards revision, which may or may not allow the use of offsets for Scope 3 emissions, and that's expected later this year. But the question is, the proposed revision for now to recognise beyond value chain emission mitigation by organisations, will this sufficiently drive financing to useful projects that are less suitable for formal carbon claims? Mark, do you want to take this?
So firstly, let's just define beyond value chain mitigation. The way SBTI and Greenhouse Gas Protocol and others define it is not just beyond value chain, it's beyond standard achievement or target achievement mitigation. So when SBTI and others talk about BVCM, what they mean is what companies done once they have already met their short or medium-term targets or demonstrated that they're about to. So that is always above and beyond. VCMI's Claims Code of Practice, which we published a year and a half ago, is exactly a framework for doing BVCM. And when we started, we expected there to be huge enthusiasm for it. We were told that was what was needed, and it hasn't borne out. There are lots of companies that use the guidance, but when we've done analysis, for most companies, if you've basically reduced your Scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions by 50% or so by 2030, that's hard work. Andrea's mentioned how hard it is. We know that the Scope 3 gap is large and growing. There are not many companies who can do that. So is it going to be a driver of action? Broadly speaking, no, for two reasons. One, it's very difficult. And two, there's one of the other questions about what's the business case for doing it. If there isn't a reputational benefit or a brand enhancement benefit from doing it, and you, in this framework, are not using the carbon credits to reduce the costs of your compliance, either with a regulation or with your voluntary target, then the business case is low, unless you are anticipating, which I think is what Tim would say, anticipating regulation in the future, anticipating obligations, and recognising you're going to have to deal with your residual emissions, and you're far-sighted enough to start investing now. But again, that's a small number of companies.
And a related question for Tim, how does Salesforce view the role of carbon credits in their own reduction initiatives, given that SBTI doesn't recognise carbon credits as emission reductions?
Yeah, I'll combine that with the other question I see there on the screen about pay to pollute,
Let's talk to that too.
because I think they're related. So, first of all, SBTI is not quite correct that they don't recognize carbon credits. They just, first of all, there's a consultation right now about this because it's an important question, and they want to come to a solid and hopefully pragmatic position. And for us, we just pull those investments forward because what would be recognized is that at the end of your target, there remains a residual gap. You would be able to compensate. We just make these investments now because the climate is in meltdown. If we wait until 2040 to invest millions of dollars a year, it'll be too late. So this is not a question for us of complying with an NGO setup framework that wants to push companies to do most of what they can in their value chain right now. It's not an and or, it's you have to do both, and you have to do both now, not in 2030 or 2040 or 2050. And on the companies that pay to pollute, I hear that a lot, but where's the data for that actually? I mean, show me 10 companies that do that and I'll believe it. I would rather see more companies that do both and invest right now and reduce their emissions. And I think there are the Green Claims Directive, and there's a California law that also stops companies from actually doing that and saying they're net zero by buying carbon credits. So that loophole has been plugged. There's no company that can get away with just buying carbon credits and saying they're carbon neutral or net zero. It's not legal. So let's do away with that myth. It's not true, and
there's a corollary to that,
Yeah.
if you think you're saying paying to pollute,
Yeah.
most advocates for action on climate change and policy would say we need to follow the polluters pays principle. So polluters should take responsibility for their emissions. And so while I would totally agree that if all you're doing is buying carbon credits, and as Tim just said, claiming you're carbon wonderful, that's not good enough. But none of the guidance out there, whether it's corporate, regulatory or voluntary guidance, suggests doing that. And so if you're suggesting that a company should not make every single effort it possibly can to reduce its own emissions and then buy carbon credits to compensate or take responsibility for its remaining emissions, if you think that's buying way out of a problem, well, let's think about the 80% of companies that Andrea mentioned that haven't even set a target yet. They're a much better target for us than worrying about some companies buying some carbon credits.
And we've only got a minute and a half, so I'm just going to quickly combine two questions about CDR because we haven't talked about it much. But the sort of flexible and voluntary aspect of the market doesn't allow for the high cost of CDR. How can that be scaled up? And equally, should carbon removals be the only credits that are considered high quality, or is there such a thing as a high integrity avoidance credit? Maybe Tim wants to take that.
So I spoke about the jurisdictional level for forests, for example. I'm a forester by training, so I love forests and nature. I could talk about that for a long time, but just want to say here that big forest ecosystems have existed for millennia. They've just discovered a tree that's actually 80,000 up to 80,000 years old in the mountains of Utah. It's a aspen tree clone, 47,000 trees that are basically one organism, has survived an ice age. So this sort of thing about nature is not durable, that's human hubris in my view. Of course, nature is durable at the large enough level. And avoidance is critical because if deforestation was a country, it would be the third largest emitter. It's around 10% just from deforestation, 25% of emissions from the agricultural and land use sector at large. So we have to plug that gap, and we have to do it with everything at our disposal: legislation, regulations, things like the EU deforestation regulation, but also the voluntary carbon market, which can channel essential money into nature.
Great. Well, thank you very much to Andrea, Tim, and Mark. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah.